All right, I'm back for the third time. I once again apologize. Just a lot of stuff going on the back end of me doing this Facebook Live. You got to stay tuned because what I'm sharing with you is so very, 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 very important. If you will, please share and host a watch party. Hit the share button and host a watch party. I believe everything will go smoothly from this point out. Once again, I do apologize, but this is so very critical for the Black community. What I'm going to try to do tonight is help us get out of the emotions of who we should support as Black Americans. Okay, we're going to get away from the 5-second sound bites. Okay, we're going to get away from the 5-second sound bites. Now, please don't tell me you can't hear me now. Okay. All right. Yes, I think it's okay. Please, everybody, let me know if you hear me fine. I'm thinking you should be able to hear me okay now. Everything looks good on my end. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? That's what I need to know before I go any further. Can you hear me okay? All right, very good. I got confirmation that you hear me fine. Excellent. So yes, this is just so very important. I want to get us away from the 5-second sound bites that you hear from Trump and that you hear from Biden, that you hear from their surrogates, and get down to the nitty gritty of what their agendas are for the Black community. I also want to put emotions to the side. Let's logically, rationally look at each guy's look at each one of their agendas, and let's see which one is most advantageous for our community. Now, what really got me looking into this was the interview that Charlemagne did with Joe Biden. And of course, we know that Joe Biden said something that offended a lot of Black people, especially Trump supporters. Okay, they were very upset with him because essentially Joe Biden said, if you're supporting Trump, you're not Black. Okay. Now, I thought that what Joe said was inartful, and I thought he shouldn't have said it, quite frankly. But the sentiment behind it, or the intent behind it, is what we want to look at tonight. What Joe was essentially said, to help me understand what Joe said, what I did was I went back and I listened to the entire interview from start to finish. And since Joe made the comment, he did say that he apologized because he said he thought that he had become a bit cavalier. I think that is absolutely right. And I think he became cavalier because Charlemagne the God baited him into becoming cavalier. Kind of loose at the mouth. He's already loose at the mouth, that's his personality. But Charlemagne the God sort of baited him and wanted him to be loose at the mouth. Okay, I presume that Charlemagne wanted him to feel comfortable saying exactly what he wanted to say, what Joe wanted to say. Charlemagne didn't want the TV Biden. He didn't want the sound bites. He didn't want the polished Biden. He wanted the real Joe Biden, and that's what Joe gave him. Okay, and Joe found out that, like many other times in his past, that was not the time to be cavalier. All right, what he said, the sentiment of it is what we're going to look at, and he should have expressed it in a better way. All right, but what he was trying to say is, if you look at my record and my agenda with respect to the Black community, in comparison to Trump's record and Trump's agenda for the Black community, as a Black person, you shouldn't have a hard time making a decision. That's what he was trying to say. That's what he should have said along those lines. Because, listen, we all know Trump's record. Trump's racist record goes back to the 70s when he and his father were sued by the Department of Justice for racial discrimination. And they settled in for what? Because they were refusing to rent apartments to African Americans. I mean, that's classic racism. It doesn't get any more racist than that. Okay? But that's not the only thing in his record. We know that he has made a bunch of racist statements before he became president. And he has made racist statements after he became president. Okay? Most infamously was when during the Charlottesville debacle, that racist stuff that went on in Charlottesville when Nazis were marching in the streets. Donald Trump called them very fine people. I mean, actual Nazis, neo-Nazis, new Nazis, people who agreed with Adolf Hitler, okay, and his racist rhetoric and practices. Donald Trump called those people very fine people. He also called the continent of Africa, nations in Africa, you know what he said, okay? He also, football players, African-American football players who were protesting racial injustice and excessive police force against black men, you know what he called them, okay? And I could go on and on and on and on. One more thing, let me mention. The 4 African-American young teenagers and the Hispanic who were falsely accused of raping a white woman, he called for the death penalty on them. And I think one of the most offensive things that he has done was for 5 to 6 years, he led the birther movement and basically said that Obama, the first black president, was an illegitimate president because he wasn't born in one of the 50 states of of America. He led that movement for 5 to 6 years. Okay? I mean, the man has a very clear, blatant record of white supremacy. When he came down the escalator and announced his candidacy, he did it in classic racism. Classic racism. He called Mexican people rapists and murderers. Okay? Rapists and murderers. And he said he presumed that some of them were good people. He presumed that they were good people. Those are just a handful of the things that are in Donald Trump's record to show that he is a racist, a white supremacist, and he has no reservation whatsoever at using racism to his personal benefit. Okay? Now, when we compare that record with Joe Biden's record, Joe doesn't have a perfect record. Okay? He doesn't have a perfect record. He is, we saw when Senator Kamala Harris, took him to task because he opposed busing. Back in the 70s, he opposed busing. And Biden is also one of the sponsors, one of the co-sponsors of the crime bill that some people argue caused a lot of mass incarceration of African Americans. But let me just point out one thing about that crime bill. It did turn out to cause some harm in the black community. But it didn't directly contribute to a whole lot of the mass incarceration, because the crime bill essentially affected federal prisons and federal sentencing. And most of the 2.3 to 2.5 million people who are in prison are not in federal prison. They're in state prison. About 2 million of those folks who are currently in prison are in state prison. And the crime bill really did not directly affect state sentencing laws. Okay. So, but again, it still played a part. Okay. It still played a part. It did some good too, because I remember in the 80s when the crack epidemic was roaring. I mean, a lot of us lost family members in this crack epidemic. It was horrible. Some of you may be too young to remember, but it was horrible. When the crack epidemic hit America, it's just like with COVID-19, it disproportionately affected the African American community. No question about it. And there was not some sort of compassionate approach like you see now with meth addicts. It was lock them up and throw the keys away. And part of that was because of all the violence associated with the crack epidemic. There's a lot of violence. A lot of young black men lost their lives. I know personally about that. Okay? I know personally about that. I lost 2 brothers, 2 younger brothers during that season and right around that time. Okay? So I know all about how horrible the crack epidemic was in the black community. Now, that's sort of a small comparison of these men's records. But what I want to focus on is their agendas, their so-called black agenda. Charlemagne the God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say the God. Charlemagne, he's not a god. And I just dislike that part of his moniker. That's his radio personality. But Charlemagne is a part of a group of African Americans who believe that the Democratic Party takes the African American vote for granted. Okay. I happen to agree with that as well. I do think the Democrat Party will begin to reach out to the black community and start sort of giving out favors, et cetera, when it's time to vote. Okay, I think they could do a lot better at really addressing the issues that disproportionately affect the African American community. And so that's why it is important for us to compare the agendas of both of these politicians. Okay, let's see which one has the better agenda. Okay, let's see which one has the best interest of the black community in mind. All right, because I think the folks who say the Democrat Party takes the black vote for granted, that's just not Charlemagne and other black Democrats who tend to be the younger crowd, but also a lot of black Republicans say the same thing. They argue that blacks need to come off the Democrat plantation, okay, and basically become Republicans because Republicans have their best interests in mind. Well, we're going to look at that tonight. We're going to take a look at the agenda of both of these politicians and see which one is taking the black agenda most seriously. All right, let's get started. All right, Joe Biden, his agenda, it is pretty thick. It's pretty big, actually. I printed it out. Bunch of pages here. I think all told, there are about 22, 23 pages. The font size of what printed on my printer actually amounted to 44 pages here. Okay, 44 pages. And when I went to Donald Trump's website to download and to review his so-called black agenda, I couldn't download it like this. I was only able to find a website, and really it was just a web page, one page of material, okay? And I'm going to refer to it as we go along here, but it was not a lot of stuff. Trust me, it was not. You can go to it yourself. I think if you Google Donald Trump for president and one of the choices in the top menu is coalitions. If you click on that link, you'll come to, I think it's called Blacks for Trump. Okay. And if you click on Blacks for Trump, then it'll take you over to the Blacks for Trump web page. And then if you click issues, you will come to the web page that has Trump's very scant Black agenda. It is very scant. I'm going to show you that. Whereas Joe has 20 something pages and a lot more depending on the size of the font. All right, let's get into it. Now, on the first page of Joe Biden's Black agenda, it says, Joe is running for president to rebuild our economy in a way that finally brings everyone along and that starts by rooting out systemic racism from our laws, our policies, our institutions, and our hearts. I think that is a strong statement to get started with his Black agenda. I think that starts his Black agenda out very strongly. He takes a very good stand right there. I like the fact that he mentions how important it is to rebuild the economy in a way that brings everyone along. And then I especially like the fact that he uses the term systemic racism. Systemic racism, another way of saying institutional racism. And he says he wants to root systemic racism from our laws, our policies, our institutions, and our hearts. I mean, I just talked about that yesterday, how important it is to get systemic, individual, institutional racism from the hearts of people. In my message yesterday, I just talked about that. And not only from our hearts, but from the institutions, the policies, the laws. I think Joe gets a 10 from the start, from the very beginning. That is a strong statement, okay? Very strong statement. And essentially, that is Joe Biden's mission for the African American community. Now, one of the reasons I think he got this right is because Joe has some African Americans around him who definitely help him write this. And they are in his ear and they are advising him about, the problems in the African American community. Now, and one thing I left out earlier about Joe's record, I gave you the bad part of Joe's record. Let me give you a couple of good things about Joe's record. In fact, he talks about his record a little bit in this, in his agenda. Joe says, I'm quoting Joe, tackling systemic racism and fighting for civil rights has been a driving force throughout Biden's career in public service. Has that been Trump's record? I mean, let's just use our common sense. Okay? Joe Biden says that tackling systemic racism and fighting for civil rights. Is there any record anywhere of Donald Trump fighting against systemic racism or fighting for civil rights? Is there anywhere in his record which would show that? Okay? And I'm not talking about the stuff that he's done as president to try to get some votes. We're going to look at all of that. All right? No, I'm talking about when we look at his record in comparison to what Joe says about his record. Has Donald Trump tackled systemic racism? Has he fought for civil rights, as Joe claims that he has? Okay. Joe, I'm going on to read now. Joe says he has a record of fighting for and delivering for the African American community. As a U.S. citizen, he co-sponsored the Civil Rights Act of 1990. The Civil Rights Act was passed in the 60s and it had to be reauthorized. Joe says here that he co-sponsored the reauthorization of the Civil Rights Act to protect African Americans against employment discrimination, and he led multiple reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act. Okay? Now, let me get a drink of water because we got to stop there just a minute. Joe said that he led efforts, multiple reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act, protecting African Americans' right to vote. What has Trump done to help with the Voting Rights Act? And see, another thing with Trump, you also got to remember if you support Trump, you support all those around him. By supporting Trump, you support Mitch McConnell. You support all the conservative justices that he's appointed. You support John Roberts. You support Sam Alito. These are the men who are on the Supreme Court. You support Neil Gorsuch. You support Clarence Thomas. You support those men who are responsible for handing down the case that Shelby versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. Okay? They gutted the Voting Rights Act. All right? Donald Trump is of the party that gutted the Voting Rights Act, whereas Joe Biden led multiple reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act. Okay? He also led efforts to reauthorize and extend the Fair Housing Act. Now, Donald Trump has put Ben Carson over HUD, and Ben Carson has infamously championed policies and regulations and laws that has damaged HUD, that has damaged the Fair Housing Act. Okay? So keep in mind, supporting Trump is supporting a whole group of folks who are enemies to the Civil Rights Movement, who are enemies to the Voting Rights Act, who are enemies to the Fair Housing Act, who are enemies to any sort of progress when it comes to Black America. All right? They have a history of that. So don't let Trump deceive you with this stuff that he's talking, because behind the scenes in his administration, there are people who are daily working to set the clock back, to set African Americans back. Literally, they're doing this. Trump leads that party. So don't let him deceive you with these little sound bites and all that he claims he's done for the African American community. He has a whole army of people who are doing tremendous damage to the Black community. All right? You remember that. Okay? So when I look at Joe Biden's record here, and I'm not a Democrat, by the way, I want you to know that. I, as an independent, can support whoever I want to support based on their positions on issues of justice and righteousness. Okay? So I'm not beholden to a particular party. I'm just calling balls and strikes right now. That's all I'm doing. I don't have any bias one way or another. I am simply calling balls and strikes. What Joe Biden just said, his record of tackling systemic racism and fighting for civil rights, and his record of fighting for the reauthorization of the Civil Rights Act and the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, is so beyond Trump's racist record. Okay? I'm just going to shoot straight with you. I'm going to tell you like it is. All right? I don't know Joe Biden, but I have no reason to doubt his record. Okay? I'm 58 years old. I've been around 58 years. I remember Joe's record in the Senate. Okay, I go back to the 80s. I can remember. And Joe has been on the side of the civil rights movement. There's no question about that. Does he have a perfect record? No, absolutely not. And let me just be honest. And Joe's an old white guy. Okay? So I'm not going to sit here and say that Joe doesn't have a racial bone in his body. I'm not going to say that at all. But I'm saying the positions that he has taken over the years, most of them have been friendly toward African Americans in comparison to Trump, whose record is filled with racism. All right, let's keep moving. So the Biden plan for America has 6 components. Here's what he says. The Biden plan for America will, 1, advance the economic mobility of African Americans and close the racial wealth and income gaps. That is huge. That is big. I put up today on Facebook that the average white family has $171,000 in wealth. The average black family has $17,000 in wealth. That is a 10-time disparity. Joe Biden's economic plan, as we go through this, you will see he addresses it head on and specifically. And I'm going to show you that Trump doesn't. Flat out, he does not. Okay? 2, the Biden plan for Black America will expand access to high quality education and tackle racial inequity in our education system. Just behind me is a book that I wrote, Education and Justice. Okay? I studied this issue. Okay? I know the inequities that are the injustices that are in the education system with respect to African American students, especially black males. Okay? Joe wants to tackle that issue. What has Trump done as president? He appointed Betsy DeVos, who has rolled back civil rights measures. The Obama administration, Obama and Joe Biden, put in place regulations in the U.S. Department of Education that were designed to address the disparate discipline practices of public schools in America against black boys. Black boys get kicked out of school more often than white kids, Asian kids, Hispanic kids, although black boys are no more hard to handle than any other kid. And if you think so, that's because you have drunk the Kool-Aid. Okay? It is not true. The data doesn't show it. Okay? Joe wants to address that. What has Trump done? Trump has put a woman in place who despises civil rights. Okay? And she has done everything she could to uproot civil rights. Okay? Third, the Biden plan for Black America will make far-reaching investments in ending health disparities by race. We are dealing with the health disparities as we speak in this COVID-19 pandemic. That is the reason why we're dying. Black Americans are dying 3 times more than white Americans because of the economic disparities as well as the health disparities. Okay? What has Trump said about that since he's been president? I think he said something on one of the news conferences that they used to do, him and Fauci and Birx. They gave those news conferences, and I said I think I remember Trump speaking on that one time. But what has he actually done? What policies? He hasn't showed any compassion about the disproportionate percentage of Black Americans who have died as a result of COVID-19. All right? He's done nothing. He said virtually nothing. Okay? We can put the emotions to the side and just look at the record. And look at the agenda. Biden also wants to strengthen America's commitment to justice. Now, Trump loved to talk about the First Step Act, okay? And there was a little good in the First Step Act, but it lacked so much. There's so much that that statute does not do that Biden addresses in this agenda, as you'll see. Biden wants to make the right to vote and the right to equal protection real for African Americans. I already pointed out to you, while he's championing the right to vote, while Biden is championing the right to vote, Trump has put people in place. He has nominated judges. He is backed and supported by a party that does everything it can to keep blacks from voting. It does voter suppression. It does racial gerrymandering. Trump is on the record as opposing mail-in ballots if this COVID-19 virus is raging come November. He is opposed to that. Joe Biden supports that. Okay? The Biden plan for Black America, lastly, addresses environmental justice. Now that is huge. The drinking water in the Black community. Have you ever noticed that in the Black community, all the landfills are in our community? All the lead pipes, all the dirty drinking water, all the air pollution, all that's in the Black community. That is environmental injustice. And it has a disparate, terrible, horrible impact on our health. Okay? Biden addresses it in his agenda. There's not one thing in Trump's agenda on that. In fact, there's so little of what Trump offers that I wouldn't even, be honest with you, call it an agenda. And I'm just being real. I'm not being partisan here. I'm being real. There's nothing here. Okay, I'm on his website now, Black Voices for Trump. I'm visiting the website. And by the way, the folks who are on his advisory board, Diamond and Silk, okay, you know, the two black women who, you know, do a lot of buffoonery for Trump. Pastor Darrell Scott, he's one of the co-chairs, and others. Okay, so I'm on Trump's, as far as I know, this is his agenda. If there's more, somebody can tell me, but I don't see any more. There's not one thing here. There are 4 categories: entrepreneurship, school choice, historically black colleges and universities, and criminal justice reform. There's nothing here that addresses health disparities. In fact, we all know, we're coming to it, we all know that Trump is doing everything he can to repeal the Obamacare, okay, which is responsible for a lot of black Americans having health insurance. Trump has made it a big part of his life to repeal anything that Obama has done, okay? It doesn't care who it hurts. Even a lot of white people will be hurt if Obamacare is gutted, all right? Black folks disproportionately need health insurance, okay? There's nothing on Trump's, for what I can see, his so-called agenda, all right? Like I said, entrepreneurship, school choice, historically black colleges, criminal justice reform, and very little on those topics. All right, now, let's talk about how Joe Biden proposes to address the economic mobility of African Americans and to close the racial wealth and income gap. So the first thing he says is he wants to invest in African American businesses and entrepreneurs. Approximately 4% of small business owners are African American. even though African American make up approximately 13% of the population. Okay? That tells us that there need to be at least 3 times more black businesses in order for there to be parity and equity in the numbers. Joe says to build wealth in African American communities, we must invest in the success of African American businesses and entrepreneurs. That's very true, because small businesses are the engine of the American economy. And that is true in the black community and every other community. Yet we, the community, have the fewest black-owned businesses. Okay? And oftentimes that has to do with our inability to get funding. Joe talks about that. In fact, he says ensuring equal access to credit and capital. Here's what he proposes. He says African American businesses often lack the capital they need to succeed. African American businesses are rejected at a rate nearly 20% higher than white-owned firms. Even worse, African American businesses that do get funding receive only 40% of the funds requested, as compared to 70% for white businesses. To increase investment and access to capital, Biden will: 1, double funding for the state small business credit initiative. The Obama-Biden administration created the State Small Business Credit Initiative, the SSBCI, to support small businesses, driving $10 billion in new lending for each $1 billion in SBCI funds. Biden will extend the program through 2025 and double its federal funding to $3 billion, driving close to $30 billion of private sector investments to small businesses, all told, especially those owned by women and people of color. All right, let me go over here to Trump's plan for that. And what I see here is entrepreneurship. Over 1.4 million more black Americans have found a job since Trump's election. First of all, he took credit for the work that Obama actually did and started, okay? When Trump came in office, jobs were going up, up, up because of the hard work of Obama and Biden, all right? And guess what? Because he mishandled this COVID-19 outbreak, because Trump mishandled this COVID-19 outbreak, a lot of those jobs have been lost, and a lot more will be lost. What is it? 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment here recently. A disproportionate percentage of those people are black Americans, okay? Because Trump, when he should have been fighting this epidemic, was on TV and everywhere else saying that, well, this will blow over. The heat will do away with it. It'll go away in the summer. We only have 3 cases. We only have 15 cases. We're handling this perfect. We got this. This is nothing. And all the time, this virus is spreading and killing people, especially black people. Okay? Then he goes on to say black poverty reached a historic low. No, it didn't. President Trump designated 8,760 opportunity zones that are projected to spare $100 billion in private investment in minority communities. The Trump administration established a fund to deploy $1 billion in capital funding for minority-owned businesses through the Commerce Department. The black poverty rate is now at its lowest level in history. All of that is questionable, and it pales in comparison to what Joe has here in his agenda. And also notice that all that I just read to you is all that Trump claims he has done. There is no future agenda here, okay? There's nothing that he says here that has to do with the future. And by the way, it's only 5 little bullet points in comparison to these pages of things that Biden is going to push if he becomes president as a part of the black agenda. Let's get back to some of those things. So Biden says he will double funding for the state small business credit initiative so more black businesses can get the funding that they need. Then he said it would expand the new markets tax credit, make the program permanent, and double community development financial institutions, CDFIs. All right. The new markets tax credit has helped draw tens of billions of dollars in new capital to low-income communities, providing tax credits to investors in community development organizations that support everything from supermarkets to real estate projects to manufacturing plants. We need all of that in our community. We need more supermarkets. There are so many food deserts in the black community. We need more real estate projects so that we can have more and better affordable housing. We need manufacturing plants so that we can put our people to work. As part of Joe Biden's plan to reinvest in communities across the country, including in rural areas, Biden will also double funding for the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, which supports local, mission-driven financial institutions to low-income areas around the U.S. Biden goes on to say that he will improve and expand the Small Business Administration programs that most effectively support African American businesses. The Small Business Administration's programs have been and remain one of the most effective ways of accessing capital for black-owned businesses. Biden will strengthen these existing programs by ensuring that the Small Business Administration has the funding it needs to support African American owned business and others in current crisis. Trump has once again proposed a massive cut of 25% in the Small Business Administration's budget for 2021, including a 35% cut in funding to small business development centers, a 20% cut to Small Business Administration microloan programs, and significantly increased fees for the 7A loan program, which is the SBA's main loan program for small businesses. So while Trump is out here talking about how much he's done in the history of the world for black people, behind the scenes, his administration is cutting funding that would help black businesses. I bet you didn't know that, because he doesn't talk about that. His administration they don't get on Fox News and say that. Okay, they say all the other stuff, but they really are hiding their hand. Biden says that he champions making permanent the successful Community Advantage Loan Program, originally created during the Obama and Biden administration. The program, which provides capital for startups and growing small businesses located in particularly underserved communities, black communities. Obama, and by the way, you hear a lot of black folks say that Obama did nothing for the black community. Those black people don't know what they're talking about. Obama and Biden did a lot to help the African American community, a lot. You just do your research and you'll see how much they did. These are just a few of the things they did to fund black businesses. Okay? The Trump administration actually reversed rules that Obama and Biden implemented under the Community Advantage Loan Program. Trump doesn't talk about that. His surrogates don't talk about that. Okay? Biden talks about increasing opportunities for African American owned businesses to obtain or participate in federal contracts. That is big. For black owned businesses that work in construction, that all sorts of sectors of the economy, we get cheated, we get looked over and get discriminated against in our efforts to get federal contracts. Okay? I've applied for contracts, okay, with the federal government and, with state government and et cetera. Biden says in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, well over $100 billion of federal prime contracting dollars were awarded to minority-owned small businesses. That was after Obama and Biden became president. And between 2013 and 2016, the Obama-Biden administration increased federal prime contract dollars going to small disadvantaged businesses by nearly 30%, from $30.6 billion to $39.1 billion. So what do you mean Obama did nothing for the black community? That people who say that have not studied the record. And by the way, when I go back over here to Trump's agenda or lack thereof, there's nothing up here about small business loans. Okay? I don't see anything over here about increasing funds for small business loans, nor do I see anything over here about how he has gutted certain programs of the Small Business Administration that were targeted, that Obama and Biden targeted for the black community. All right? Don't listen to Trump's rhetoric. Look at his record and look at his agenda. Don't listen even to a lot of black conservatives, okay? Because they probably they're overlooking his record or haven't looked at his record, nor do they know what his agenda is. Do your own research. Put the emotions to the side, okay? Put that to the side. Look at the record. Look at the policies. Look at the programs. Look at the agenda. Make your decision based on that. Listen, if Trump was talking about all of this and championing these programs and these ways to fund black businesses and to empower the black community and was really earnestly doing these things, I'd be listening to Trump. I'd be supporting Trump. Because again, it doesn't matter Republican or Democrat as far as I'm concerned. I want to simply know who will do right by the black community. And Joe Biden has put forth an agenda, detailed. This is just the second or third page. We haven't gotten into everything that he intends to do, that he has planned, his agenda. Donald Trump's stuff over here is like one page. Literally, go look at it for yourself. Okay? Increase funding for the Minority Business Development Agency budget. Now, watch this. The MBDA, the Minority Business Development Agency, plays a critical role in supporting the development and growth of minority-owned businesses around the country, as well as providing needed assistance to federal and state agencies so they can award minority-owned businesses procurement contracts. The Trump administration has pushed for a 75% cut in the MBDA's budget. Biden would protect and call for increased funding for that budget. Trump, I want you to hear this, the Trump administration, which some of you all are just so strongly supporting, it has pushed for a 75% cut in the Minority Business Development Agency, the agency that is tasked with helping black businesses get started and thrive and provide jobs and generate capital revenue and help our community. Trump has cut the budget of that program, or pushed for a cut, to the tune of 75%. How was that man? How was he a friend of the black community? You remember he asked the question when he was on the campaign trail, what do you have to lose? Your schools are no good. Your neighborhoods are no good. You're no good, basically. Well, here's what we got to lose. We got funding for the Minority Business Development Agency, That's what we got to lose. We lost funding to the Small Business Administration that was intended for Black American businesses. That's what we got to lose. Okay? Or I could go on and on and on with what we have lost with the Trump administration. Joe Biden talks about protecting small and disadvantaged businesses from federal and state contract bundling, which often locks out African-American owned smaller firms from effectively bidding or procuring contracts. I went to one of these meetings about getting government contracts, and that was brought up, the bundling thing, and that is how the big companies can get contracts through this bundling process, and the smaller, oftentimes African-American companies, the smaller ones, they get left out through this bundling process. I'm so elated to hear, when I read this, I was elated to hear that Joe even mentions this. I mean, that is critical. I sat in a 2-hour meeting and listened to other Black business owners complain, person after person after person, about how bundling has kept them from getting business contracts for their businesses. Joe says that he wants to make sure economic relief from the COVID-19 epidemic reaches the African-American businesses that need it most. Now watch this. The first installment of the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, largely left out minority-owned businesses. The Center for Responsible Lending estimates that more than 90% of small businesses owned by people of color will not receive loans. Joe wants to fix that, because the African-American community has not only been hit hard with deaths, but also with the death of their businesses, all right, closing down. And a lot of them were overlooked. They got discriminated against by the Trump administration. Do you get me? So when I hear these people talking about Trump 2020, I'm for Trump, I just wonder, have they really, really done their research? I just don't see how they can support a man who has done this much damage in only 3 years and want to give him another 4 years to do even more damage to our community. It's hard for me to get my head around that. Okay? Biden talks about providing African-American entrepreneurs and other small business owners with technical assistance. And on and on. He also talks about supporting African-American churches during the COVID-19 crisis, because yes, Black churches are suffering economically because, we're not having service. And so the offerings are down and so forth. So Biden even mentions that. Now, what Trump did was he said, everybody go back to church. Everybody go back to church. But fortunately, most Black pastors were wise enough to know that we don't need to be just gathering together in these large crowds right now until this virus is more under control. All right. Joe understands that, but yet want to get some economic help to African-American churches. I'm trying to move on a little bit here because this is just one sector. Joe then talks about expanding African-American home ownership and access to affordable, safe housing. Let me take another drink of water. Joe says in his agenda here, the gap between African-American and white ownership is larger today than when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. Let me read that again. In his agenda here, he says the gap between black and white home ownership is larger today than when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. This has contributed to a jaw-dropping racial wealth gap nearly 1,000% between medium white and African American households. Because home ownership is how most families save and build wealth, the disparity in home ownership is a central driver of the racial wealth gap. As president, Biden will invest $640 billion over 10 years so every American has access to housing that is affordable, stable, safe, and healthy, accessible, energy efficient, resilient, and located near good schools with a reasonable commute to their jobs. Now, let me look over here and see what Trump says about the wealth gap in home ownership and the Fair Housing Act and all of that. And what do I see here? Nothing. Not one thing. Okay? So, to address the gap in home ownership, Joe proposes that he will help families buy their first homes and build wealth by creating a new refundable, advanceable tax credit of up to $15,000. So first-time home buyers will be able to claim a $15,000 tax credit if Joe Biden is elected and can get this through Congress. And by the way, that's an issue, right? All this is good, but can he get it through Congress? Well, yes, if enough of us go out and vote, and not only vote Biden in and Trump out, but vote a lot of those Republicans out who would do nothing to help the black community. And that, well, I'm just talking straight. Mitch McConnell won't lift a finger to help black people. Okay? Not one finger, not one finger. Most of them will do nothing to help the black community. They're too busy trying to hurt the black community. All right? Joe Biden will tackle racial bias that leads to homes in communities of color being assessed by appraisers below their fair value. We know this happens all the time. If you live in a predominantly black neighborhood and your subdivision is nice and your home is nice and your yards are well kept up and crime is low, etc., just because it is a predominantly black neighborhood, appraisers will still assess it, value it lower than a similarly situated white community in another part of town or in another part of the county. We know that happens. Okay? And that is tremendous because that hurts your equity, right? Because of that unfair, discriminatory assessment of the value of your home, $30,000, $40,000 lower than the white community, you just lost $30,000, $40,000. Joe says that he wants to address that. To address it, he said that he will establish a national standard for housing appraisals that ensures appraisers have adequate training and a full appreciation for neighborhoods and do not hold implicit biases because of a lack of community understanding. Let me see what Trump says about this. Nothing. Nothing. Biden says he wants to roll back Trump administration policies, gutting fair lending and fair housing protections, strongly enforcing fair credit reporting laws, and create a new public credit reporting agency. Okay? The Trump administration, led by Ben Carson, has done a lot to hurt the housing protections that Congress passed many years ago. All right? And you have to ask yourself, why would Ben Carson do that? He's African American. I don't know. I don't know. I'm lost for words. I don't get it. Like I said, the damage that Trump has done in our community, to our community now, why any black person would support him and want to rehire him for another 4 years, I just don't get it. When you look at the record and when you look at the agenda. Biden says he wants to protect homeowners and renters from abusive lenders and landlords through a new homeowner and renter Bill of Rights. Donald Trump knows all about that, having been sued for racial housing discrimination. Okay? But that's something, and I don't want to gloss over that, because during the 2008, 2009 Great Recession, you know who was hit the hardest? Black Americans. You know why? Because many of them had been taken advantage of by racist policies in various banks. Wells Fargo comes to mind. Bank of America comes to mind. So when the foreclosures begin to hit, who did they hit hardest? Black Americans. Why? Because Black Americans were pushed, despite having as good a credit as white Americans, they were pushed into predatory loans. Okay? And when the economy started rattling and rolling and shaking, they couldn't pay the mortgages on those subprime mortgages. They couldn't pay the note. And so disproportionately, Black Americans were foreclosed upon and lost a lot of wealth, because the average Black family has probably 95% of its wealth in their homes. So a lot of Black Americans were wiped out. Joe takes note of that, and he wants to address that. Okay? Him and Obama were presidents, so they were, Obama was president, he was vice president. So they were aware that this was going on. Let's see what Trump says about that in his agenda. Nothing. Not one word. Nothing. Okay? Joe talks about holding financial institutions accountable for discriminatory practices in the housing market. In 2013, the Obama-Biden administration codified a long-standing court-supported view that lending practices that have a discriminatory effect can be challenged even if discrimination was not explicit. As a lawyer, I'm telling you that is so important, because a lot of times discrimination is not explicit. Oftentimes it's hidden, it's covert, it's under the radar screen. So Obama and Biden supported and championed practices, lending practices they championed where folks could sue lenders who discriminated against Black folks, but the discrimination was not explicit. But now the Trump administration is seeking to gut this disparate impact standard by significantly increasing the burden of proof for those claiming discrimination. Did you know that? Black Trump supporter? Did you know that Donald Trump is right now trying to gut this standard so that if a Black family has experienced discrimination from a lender, the burden of proof would be much higher if Trump gets its way, if the Trump administration gets its way? That's what you're supporting? That's what you're wanting to give Donald Trump 4 more years to do? Really? Wow. You see now why Joe said what he said? That's why he said it. Okay? Joe wants to restore the federal government's power to enforce settlements against discriminatory lenders. The Trump administration, on the other hand, has stripped the Office of Fair Lending and Equal Opportunity, a division of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, of its power to enforce settlements against lenders found to have discriminated against borrowers. Okay? So if you sue a lender and prove that there was discrimination and get a settlement, that settlement under the Trump administration is about as good as a piece of paper. You can't collect on it. So what's the point of suing them if you can't collect? If you got to spend a lot of litigation money, but then when you win your case and you try to collect on your settlement, the lender gives you the finger because it knows that Trump has policies in place to protect them. That's what you're supporting, Black Trump supporter? Really? Oh, man, I've been here for now about an hour. I haven't even gotten through half of this agenda. I tell you what, I'm going to do part 2 tomorrow. This is part 1. We got to go through this because we haven't even touched on education. We haven't touched on health. We haven't touched on the criminal justice reform. So much we haven't even touched on. Okay, we're still dealing with the economics and the housing. But we can't stop there. Okay? Tonight, part 1, we talked about the Black agenda, Biden versus Trump. And keep in mind, I want you to keep in mind that I am not I'm not a Democrat. I'm not just, doing this because I'm such a Biden lover, a Biden fan. This is not personal. I'm looking at this man's agenda, and I'm looking at his record, and I'm comparing his agenda and his record to the agenda and the record of Donald Trump. It's not personal. Okay? I'm just looking at the objective, hard facts. And so far, what I've seen causes me to come over, causes me to support what I'm hearing Biden has to say. Okay? Trump doesn't have much of anything to say, and his record is deplorable. This to me is simple. It's pretty simple. I don't understand any African American who after reading this, but we know how people are, okay? When people make a decision, even if it's wrong, even if it's wrong-headed, even if it is just obviously a bad, idiotic decision, even if it hurts them, people most of the time will defend that decision. They'll find reasons why their decision is a good decision. Okay? Yeah, well, I'm just gonna do it. I'm just ain't nothing you can say, yeah, I'm just gonna do it. And have gotten away from all objectivity. Okay? So, we just have those folks in our community, but for those of you who are willing to take an objective look at Biden's agenda versus whatever this is that Trump has here. I mean, I'm not being ugly, but it's just not very much here. You can see it for yourself. Go to blackvoices.donaldjtrump.com/issues and you'll see what I'm saying. If this is his so-called black agenda, this is pathetic. Now, there may be something else that I don't know about. Maybe the White House .gov website has more or something. I don't know. But what Joe has outlined here in his agenda, no matter what else somebody could show me, these are the facts. Trump is trying to gut certain programs to help black Americans. Okay? And some of that is racist. And some of that is just to try and cover that big tax cut he gave his rich friends. Okay? Remember that? Remember that 1 point something trillion tax cut that he gave his big friend, that he gave his rich friends? He has to pay for that. Where's that money come from? From a lot of programs designed especially to help African Americans. So some of it is racism, and some of it is what, classism? It's just the rich trying to help the rich. Okay? All right. We're going to pick this up again tomorrow, part 2. I'm going to go through this agenda line by line, and I'm going to compare them. All right? Please come back with me tomorrow, about 7 o'clock or so tomorrow evening, God willing. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.